When the pilot lost consciousness due to a tragic error, a 12-year-old boy took the controls. But what he did next shocked all the passengers. The sun had just started to rise when 12-year-old Tom walked through the automatic doors of the airport, his eyes filled with anticipation. He carried a small backpack adorned with airplane stickers and clutched his essential aviation book. His mother, Camilla, walked beside him, pushing a black suitcase and wearing a tired but proud smile. This flight wasn't just a gift. It was the culmination of months of hard work, overtime, and savings. Camilla had long planned this trip to the sunny city of Miami for herself and her son. They were set to spend a week enjoying the sea and amusement parks. For Tom, this was his first flight, and he could hardly hide his excitement. His mother had told him about the walks along the boardwalk, visits to the aquarium, and cable car rides in the mountains. But what thrilled him the most was the upcoming visit to an airfield as part of a tour program, where he would see real airplanes and even sit in the cockpit, a prospect that only amplified his enthusiasm. "Tom, you're going to love it. We'll ride carousels, explore the botanical garden, and even see planes up close," Camilla said with a smile, trying to match his excitement. "Mom, I want to see the cockpit. Do you think they'll show me how everything works?" he asked, his eyes shining. "Maybe," she replied, teasing him with a little mystery. "But that's a surprise." Tom pressed his face against the window, imagining how, in just a few hours, they'd be by the sea. He envisioned seeing waves for the first time, smelling the salty air, and of course, hearing the roar of the airplanes on the tour. At the departure gate, Tom could barely contain his excitement, pointing out planes on the runway and accurately identifying their models and airlines. "Look, Mom, that's a Boeing. And over there, that's an Airbus A320, he exclaimed excitedly. Camilla, who didn't know much about aviation, was infected by her son's enthusiasm. "You really know everything about planes, my boy. I know you're going to be the best pilot someday." Soon the magical moment of boarding arrived. Tom took a deep breath as he walked down the narrow aisle of the airplane. His eyes darted to every detail: the seat upholstery, the overhead bins, the ceiling lights. He even tried to sneak a glance into the cockpit as he passed by. To him, every aspect of the plane seemed designed to spark awe. "Mom, did you notice that man?" Tom quietly asked as they settled into their seats. "He doesn't seem to be happy about anything." Camilla smiled and leaned closer to her son. "Sometimes people just have bad days, Tom," she said. Tom pressed his face against the window, watching the runway and the mechanics working nearby. To him, life at the airport felt like it belonged to another world. Everything was so organized, like every person and every detail had its place. "Mom, did you know that a Boeing 747 like this one can reach speeds of up to 988 kilometers per hour?" he asked excitedly. "That's impressive, son," Camilla replied as she fastened her seatbelt. "Who knows, maybe one day you'll be flying one of these yourself." Tom smiled and turned his gaze back to the window, dreaming about the day when he might sit in the cockpit as a pilot. As the plane taxied onto the runway, Tom felt adrenaline rushing through his body, the increasing roar of the engines, the vibrations beneath him, and finally the moment of takeoff. All of it made him press deeper into his seat as the plane ascended into the sky, and the world below turned into a sea of clouds. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, a stewardess walked down the aisle. Despite his natural shyness, Tom mustered the courage to speak to her. "Excuse me, what altitude are we at?" he asked. The stewardess smiled, surprised by the question. "We're at 10,000 meters. Do you like aviation?" Tom nodded eagerly. "Yes, I spend hours on flight simulators. I know how autopilot works and even how to read basic instruments." Camilla couldn't help but chuckle at her son's boldness. The stewardess seemed genuinely impressed. "You sound like a real expert. Keep it up. Maybe one day we'll be colleagues." She continued down the aisle but paused to hand Tom a sticker with the airline's logo, which he tucked away like a treasured trophy. The flight continued smoothly, and Tom was completely immersed in the experience. He enjoyed every moment, even the simple in-flight meal, and paid close attention to everything he saw, from the safety instructions to the flashing lights and crew announcements. For him, this was more than a flight. It was a dream come true. But as the plane soared over the endless expanse of ocean, a slight jolt disrupted the tranquility. It felt as if the plane had bounced in midair. Tom noticed how a tense silence filled the cabin. Passengers began glancing at each other nervously, whispering uncertainly. Soon the captain's calm voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are passing through a minor turbulence zone. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Everything is under control. Tom tightened his seatbelt, trying to conceal his concern, but his eyes remained fixed on the wing, which swayed slightly. He knew turbulence was normal, but something about this felt off. Camilla noticed her son's unease and placed a reassuring hand over his. It's okay, sweetheart. This happens sometimes. The pilot knows what he's doing, she said gently. Tom nodded but kept his gaze on the window. A few minutes later, the plane jolted again, this time more violently. The seatbelt signs above the seats began flashing urgently, signaling danger. The flight attendants hurried down the aisle, ensuring all passengers were strapped in and trying to calm those who looked especially frightened. Panic was beginning to spread. A woman seated a few rows ahead struggled to buckle her youngest child, who was crying loudly, while her older child clung to her hand, asking, Mom, what's happening? Are we going to fall? Of course not. No, she replied in a trembling voice, but her face was pale. In the back row, an elderly couple sat silently, holding hands tightly. The man whispered something to his partner, but their eyes betrayed their worry. Passengers glanced nervously at one another, trying to gauge the seriousness of the situation. A few prayed, clutching the seat backs in front of them. Suddenly, a loud voice broke through the tense atmosphere. It was the irritated man who had already caught Tom's attention earlier. What's going on? Where's the crew? Why isn't anyone telling us anything? Are they having tea up there? He shouted, turning to a nearby flight attendant, his voice nearing a yell. Do you even understand how dangerous this is? Call the captain immediately and make him explain what's happening. The flight attendant, trying to maintain her composure, responded in a steady tone. Sir, please remain seated and fasten your seatbelt. The crew is doing everything possible to ensure your safety. But the man only grew more agitated. Safety? You call this safety? Why is the plane shaking? We paid for this flight, not to be tossed around like this. His loud complaints only heightened the tension among the passengers. One of the nearby passengers attempted to calm him. Sir, please, relax. You're only making things worse for everyone. The man waved him off angrily. And who are you to tell me what to do? Tom observed the unfolding scene, gripping the armrests of his seat. The growing atmosphere of fear unsettled him. It seemed as though panic was spreading like wildfire. The plane jolted again, accompanied by a grating sound of metal that elicited screams and gasps. Tom took a deep breath, trying to resist the mounting anxiety around him, though he felt his own hands trembling slightly. He understood all too well what such sounds could mean. Suddenly, the plane tilted sharply to one side, producing another loud metallic groan. Screams erupted throughout the cabin as some passengers began to pray, while others panicked openly. Tom glanced at Camilla, who forced a calm smile, despite the fear evident in her eyes. But Tom sensed something was seriously wrong. The plane began to lose altitude gradually, and Tom closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He didn't yet know that ahead of him lay the most challenging task of his life. The plane shook violently, as though it were a piece of paper caught in a storm. Passengers cried out. Some wept, while others gripped their armrests with such force that their fingers turned white. Panic and helplessness filled the cabin. A young couple seated across the aisle from Tom held hands tightly. The girl sobbed quietly, staring at her partner. We're not going to crash, are we? She whispered. Everything will be fine, the young man replied, though his trembling voice betrayed his fear. An elderly woman seated by the window clutched a small cross, running her fingers over it while murmuring a prayer. Her seatmate, an older man in glasses, wiped sweat from his brow with a handkerchief, breathing heavily. A few rows ahead, the woman with two young children was desperately trying to calm her youngest, who screamed and reached for her neck. Mom, I'm scared, he cried, gasping for breath between sobs. The older boy sat silently, gripping the armrest. His lips trembled, but he held back his tears. It'll be okay, sweetheart, the woman said, even though she herself was on the verge of tears. Some passengers silently stared out the window, as if hoping to find answers or solace there. Others sat with their eyes closed, looking like they were trying to escape reality. Meanwhile, the irritated man in the suit continued loudly voicing his complaints. This is outrageous. Why isn't anyone explaining anything? Where's the pilot? Why is the plane shaking? Are they all asleep up there? His angry tone only made the tension worse. Passengers seated nearby gave him disapproving looks, but no one dared to speak up. Sit down and shut up, someone barked from the back rows, but the man just scoffed angrily. In the aisle, a stewardess tried to maintain her composure as she moved past the seats, checking that everyone was buckled in. Her calm, steady voice barely broke through the noise around her. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats. Everything is under control. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain calm. But few passengers were paying attention. The cabin was filled with the sounds of crying, anxious conversations, and the clatter of falling objects. Tom clung to his seat, gripping the armrest tightly, while Camilla squeezed his hand with all her strength. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, but she forced a smile to reassure her son. It'll be okay, Tom. Hang in there, she said, though Tom could feel the panic creeping into her voice. The situation felt out of control, and even his mom's steady reassurance couldn't completely calm him. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, but this time it was tense. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing severe turbulence. Please remain in your seats and do not leave them. But Tom noticed something strange. Despite the captain's announcement, an unsettling silence came from the cockpit. He knew that in situations like this, pilots usually stayed in contact with the crew or gave passengers more updates. Tom turned to Camilla. Mom, something's wrong. They should be talking more, explaining what's going on. Camilla looked at him, surprised, but before she could answer, the plane suddenly lurched to the side. The sound of oxygen masks dropping filled the cabin, and now they dangled above their heads. Tom and Camilla quickly put on their masks, but the boy couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. In the aisle, the stewardess was still trying to calm the passengers. Her voice was steady, but the worry in her expression was unmistakable. Gathering his courage, Tom called out to her, despite his fear. Excuse me, ma'am, but what's happening in the cockpit? I think something's not right. The stewardess stopped and frowned. Everything's under control, kid, she said, but Tom interrupted her. It's not. If everything was fine, the pilots would be talking to us more. I know this from the safety instructions. I've read about it and watched videos. Something's wrong. I'm sure of it. The stewardess hesitated. Her eyes darted toward the cockpit. She was clearly trying to stay calm, but there was fear in her voice. We can't open the door without permission. I assure you, everything is fine. Don't let your imagination run wild. The pilots know what they're doing. Tom looked her in the eyes with a serious, almost adult-like expression. What if something happened to them, and no one's controlling the plane? We have to check. Please, we need to get into the cockpit. Camilla tried to intervene, placing a hand on Tom's shoulder. Tom, this isn't your responsibility. You're just a kid. But the boy couldn't take his eyes off the cockpit. His anxious gaze betrayed the growing fear inside him. The plane shook harder than before, and screams erupted from the cabin. At that moment, the irritable man in the suit appeared in the aisle. He had risen from his seat, swaying from the turbulence, and waved his hands sharply to get the attention of the nearest flight attendant. What is this chaos? He started shouting, trying to overpower the noise. Where are the pilots? Why aren't they saying anything? What the hell is going on? The flight attendant, still trying to maintain her composure, turned to him. Sir, I must ask you to return to your seat and fasten your seatbelt. We are doing everything possible to ensure your safety. But the man wasn't listening. His face was red with anger. You call this safety? The plane's being tossed around like a toy, and you're just walking around like nothing's wrong. Contact the pilots right now and make them explain what's happening. The stewardess responded in a steady voice. The captain has already instructed everyone to remain seated and fasten their seatbelts. I'm asking you to calm down. Calm down, he interrupted. You think this is normal? You're just sitting here, waiting for us to crash, and we're not even being told what's happening. His loud voice drew the attention of the already frightened passengers. Some turned to look at him, while others tried to shout him down. Sir, sit down! You're making things worse! But he waved them off, continuing to yell. What do you people know? Your lives are at stake too. I demand an explanation. Tom watched the scene unfold in horror. The man's shouting only made things worse. Someone in the cabin started crying again. Stewardess, who still looked calm but visibly exhausted, replied, "We've relayed all the necessary information to the captain. I'm asking you again to return to your seat. Your behavior is interfering with the crew's work." "It's your incompetence that's the problem," the man snapped. But eventually he slowly returned to his seat, grumbling loudly. "No accountability. I paid good money for this." Camilla, who had been anxiously watching the argument, squeezed Tom's shoulder again. "Sweetheart, don't worry. Everything's under control," she said softly. But Tom couldn't stop the thoughts racing through his mind. What if that man was right? Why were the pilots so quiet? His eyes returned to the cockpit door, behind which an eerie silence lingered. Then the plane jolted again, and suddenly it began to lose altitude rapidly. The sound of crashing objects filled the cabin. Cups and trays flew through the air as passengers screamed, while others squeezed their eyes shut and prayed. From the cockpit came alarming noises, sounds that even Tom could recognize as danger alarms. This was the final straw for Stewardess. She ran to the cockpit door and punched in the emergency code on the panel. The door slowly opened, revealing a horrifying scene. Both pilots were unconscious. Their bodies slumped over the controls. Oxygen masks dangled uselessly beside their faces, and the cockpit was flashing with dozens of red and yellow warning lights. The sound of blaring sirens filled the air. The plane was descending at a sharp angle. The stewardess gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "Oh my God! They're unconscious! What do we do?" Tom stepped forward, despite Camilla's attempts to hold him back. "I recognize those alarms. The autopilot disengaged. We're losing altitude." Stewardess, panicking, pressed the emergency communication button to contact the control tower, but no response came. The connection was delayed due to severe weather conditions. Every second felt like an eternity as the plane continued to plummet. Tom spun around to face her. "We don't have time to wait for help. I know how to operate the basic systems. Let me try to stabilize the plane." The woman froze in indecision, staring at the thin boy whose eyes blazed with determination. "Do you really know what you're doing?" she asked, her voice full of desperation. Tom took a deep breath, trying to appear more confident than he felt. "I'm not a pilot, but I've trained on simulators. I know how to read the instruments and re-engage the autopilot. It's our only chance until the controllers respond." The stewardess looked around the cockpit, at the blinking warning lights and the unconscious pilots, then back at Tom. "But according to safety regulations, I can't let you into the cockpit," she began sternly. "I'm required to establish contact with air traffic control immediately." She activated the emergency communication system and began entering the code to connect with ground services. But static was the only response from the speakers. Communication was disrupted by the severe atmospheric conditions. She tried again, but still nothing. Her face turned pale, and her fingers trembled slightly. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath. Tom, watching her struggle, realized the situation was becoming critical. "Do you hear that?" he said insistently. "No one's answering. We're running out of time. I can help." She tried to maintain her composure, but the boy's voice made her pause. She understood perfectly well that this was an extraordinary situation, and there was almost no choice left. Another glance at the pilot's motionless bodies convinced her that there was no time to waste. "You're absolutely sure you know how the autopilot works?" she asked. Her voice trembled, betraying her internal conflict. "I've read about this and practiced on simulators," Tom answered confidently. "I know how to engage the autopilot and keep the plane steady." The stewardess took a deep breath, weighing the consequences. According to all protocols, she was supposed to wait for assistance or instructions from the control tower. But right now there was no communication. The pilots were unconscious, and the plane was still losing altitude. "All right," she finally said, locking eyes with him. "But I'm staying with you the entire time. Understood?" Tom nodded, feeling the immense weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. The stewardess entered the emergency override code on the panel, and the cockpit door slowly slid open. The scene before them was terrifying. The pilots were slumped over, their heads hanging against their chests. Oxygen masks swung uselessly beside their faces. The control panel was lit up with dozens of red warning indicators, and alarms blared through the cabin. The plane was still descending rapidly. The stewardess closed her eyes for a moment, processing the situation, then nodded as if steeling herself for what was to come. All right, do what you can, but I'll be right here with you. Camilla, though terrified, realized her son was right. She wiped away her tears and let go of his hand. Be safe, Tom. I believe in you. Tom stepped into the cockpit, his hands trembling as he took the co-pilot's seat. Before him, chaos reigned. Blinking warning lights, deafening sirens, and a rapidly descending plane. He took a deep breath, scanning the control panel and forcing himself to focus. Try to contact the control tower again, he called to stewardess. She reactivated the communication system, but all that came through was static. Keep trying, Tom shouted. After a few agonizing moments, a calm but tense voice came through. This is Moscow Flight Control Center. Who is at the controls? Tom grabbed the microphone with shaking hands. This is Tom, a passenger. The pilots are unconscious. I'm in the cockpit. The plane is falling. We need help. There was a brief pause before the voice responded. Understood, Tom. We're with you. Stay calm and I'll guide you through this. You can do it. The voice, however, carried a hint of disbelief. After another pause, the voice added, Wait, you said your name is Tom? You're a passenger? Where is the captain? What's happening in the cockpit? Tom looked at the stewardess and passed her the microphone. She, still trying to maintain her composure, answered, This is stewardess. We have an emergency situation. The pilots are unconscious and I haven't been able to make contact with them. We're losing altitude. Communication was down earlier, and Tom is the only one who has even basic knowledge of how the autopilot works. On the other end of the line, there was a sharp intake of breath, which could have been shock or frustration. The controller's voice grew more tense. Are you serious? A child? Are you telling me a boy is at the controls of a passenger plane? This is completely irresponsible. The stewardess felt her heart race. She knew the situation was critical, but the controller's outrage was the last thing she needed. She responded firmly, We had no other choice. Communication with you was lost. The pilots are incapacitated, and this boy understands the basics of operating the autopilot. If you have a better suggestion, I'm all ears. The controller was silent for a few moments, then spoke again in a calmer tone. The situation is clear. Stay calm. We'll work together to stabilize the plane. Tom grabbed the microphone again, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. I'm ready to follow your instructions. Just tell me what to do. Despite his earlier frustration, the air traffic controller recognized that the priority was now to maintain composure and guide them through this crisis. His tone became clear and professional. All right, Tom, let's start with something simple. Can you see the autopilot indicator on the panel? Tom nodded, then responded with a detailed description of what he saw on the control panel. The stewardess exhaled quietly, realizing that everything now depended on this fragile connection between the cockpit and the control tower. The controller's voice was steady and reassuring. Tom, the first thing we need to do is stabilize the plane. Look at the instrument in front of you. It's called the artificial horizon. Do you see it? Tom quickly identified the instrument, showing the plane's orientation relative to the horizon. The indicator was tilted sharply downward, signaling a dangerous descent. I see it, he replied. Good. Now take the yoke in front of you and gently pull it toward you. Be very careful. No sudden movements. We don't want to send the plane into a spin. Tom gripped the yoke with both hands. His fingers trembled, but he took a deep breath and slowly pulled back. The plane began to level out slightly but jolted again, causing a fresh wave of panic among the passengers. It's too heavy, Tom shouted in frustration. That's okay, the controller said calmly, his voice steady. You're doing great, Tom. You're already helping to stabilize the plane. Gradually, the aircraft's position began to improve. On the artificial horizon, the line moved closer to the center. Tom felt a small surge of relief, but knew they were far from safe. All right, the controller continued. Now, we need to engage the autopilot. Look to the left of the yoke. You should see the autopilot indicator. Tom scanned the panel quickly and spotted a button labeled Autopilot. The indicator light beside it was flashing red. I found it, but it's off, he said. That's fine. Press the button. It will help stabilize the controls. Tom pressed the button, and the indicator light turned green. The cabin grew quieter as some of the alarms silenced. The plane stopped pitching erratically and leveled out. Stewardess, who had been gripping the back of the pilot's chair, let out a sigh of relief. "Tom, you're amazing," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Her words were abruptly interrupted by an angry, booming voice. Standing in the doorway of the cockpit was the irate man in the suit. His face was flushed with indignation, and his eyes burned with fury. "What is this circus?" he shouted, pointing at Tom. "Are you seriously letting a child fly the plane? Is this your idea of safety?" The stewardess turned to the man, trying to maintain her composure. "Sir, I kindly ask you to return to your seat immediately. The situation is under control." "Under control?" he snapped, slamming his hand against the doorframe. "This child is flying the plane. Are you out of your mind? Do you understand how many lives you're putting at risk?" Tom glanced at the man. He felt uncomfortable but knew he couldn't allow himself to get distracted. His hands remained firmly on the yoke as he continued following the air traffic controller's instructions. "Listen," the stewardess began, her patience wearing thin. "We have no other option. The pilots are incapacitated. This boy is our only chance." "Chance?" the man repeated sarcastically, glaring at Tom. "He doesn't even know what he's doing, and you've just handed over the controls to a kid." "Sir," the stewardess responded firmly, "your emotions aren't helping anyone right now. If you can't remain calm, please return to your seat." But the man wasn't backing down. "I won't let this slide. You've all lost your minds if you think this is acceptable. I'm going to sue this airline for negligence." At that moment, the controller's voice came through the speakers. "I strongly urge the passenger to leave the cockpit. We need to focus on flying the plane, and any interference could cost us valuable time." The man shook his head, casting one last angry look at the stewardess and Tom. Finally, though, he stepped out, muttering under his breath, "Irresponsible fools! You're going to get us all killed." The stewardess turned back to Tom, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't let it get to you. You're doing great. Just listen to the controller. We've got this." Tom nodded, his focus snapping back to the control panel. His heart was still racing, but he knew the challenges were far from over. "What's next?" he asked the controller. "Now we need to reduce speed to prepare for landing. Look at the panel and locate the throttle levers. They should be on your right." Tom scanned the panel and found two large levers. He gripped them with both hands, awaiting further instructions. "Perfect. Now slowly pull them back to reduce engine thrust. Do it gradually to maintain lift." Tom began pulling the levers back. The plane shuddered slightly as the speed decreased. Suddenly, a new red indicator lit up on the panel, accompanied by a warning chime. "A new signal!" Tom shouted, his breathing quickening. The controller's voice was swift and calm. "Don't panic. That's a cabin pressure warning. You need to check if the automatic pressurization system is on. Look at the overhead panel and find the switch labeled Pressurization." Tom quickly glanced up and found the switch. It was set to off. He immediately flipped it to on. The alarm stopped. The dispatcher's voice praised him warmly. "Great job, Tom. Now comes the hardest part. Landing. Are you ready?" Tom took a deep breath. His hands were still trembling, but he answered firmly, "Yes." "Okay. All right, listen carefully. We're redirecting you to the nearest airport. I'll guide you through setting the course." "Okay," Tom replied, his voice shaky. "Look at the navigation panel in front of you. Do you see the button labeled Course?" "Yes, I see it." "Turn it to set a heading of 230 degrees. That will take you straight to the airport." Tom carefully turned the knob, watching as the needle on the screen slowly moved to the correct heading. "Done. I've set the course to 230 degrees. "Excellent, Tom. Now we need to descend to 2,700 meters. To do that, gently lower the altitude control lever." Following the instructions, Tom adjusted the lever, and the plane began to descend smoothly. The tension in his chest eased slightly, though he knew there was still much to do. Meanwhile, the stewardess returned to the cabin to address the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, trying to keep her voice steady, "we're experiencing an emergency situation, but everything is under control. Please remain seated and follow the cruise instructions." The passengers, though frightened, calmed down a little after hearing her words. Camilla sat in her seat, clutching her hands tightly, silently praying for her son. She was proud of his bravery, though her heart was gripped with fear. Tom continued to follow the dispatcher's instructions. "You're doing great, Tom. Now we need to prepare for landing. Look at the panel and find the landing gear indicator." Tom quickly located the necessary switch. "Found it. Good. Activate it to deploy the landing gear." Tom flipped the switch, but a red light appeared on the panel. "The landing gear is deployed." "Fantastic job, Tom. Now for the most critical part, the landing. I'll guide you step by step." The plane approached the airport, and through the clouds, the runway lights began to emerge. Tom reduced the speed to 240 kilometers per hour, eased back the engine thrust a little more. Tom followed the instructions, and the plane started to slow down. "Now level the plane with the horizon and keep it steady. Do you see the runway?" "Yes, I see it." "Great. Carefully align the plane with the runway. Take your time. You're doing great." Tom's heart was pounding, his hands still shaking, but he focused on the controls. The plane descended steadily, approaching the ground. In the cabin, the passengers held their breath. Some were praying, others clutched hands tightly. Camilla stared ahead, whispering words of encouragement to her son. Finally, the plane's wheels touched the ground with a light bump, and it began to roll down the runway. The dispatcher's voice came through the speakers. "Outstanding work, Tom. You did it." The cabin erupted in applause and cheers of joy. The stewardess couldn't hold back her tears. Tom shut off the engines and leaned back in the seat, overwhelmed with relief. Rescuers and airport staff burst into the cockpit. Camilla rushed to her son and hugged him tightly. "I'm so proud of you, my hero," she said, her voice trembling. Tom smiled faintly, though he felt utterly exhausted. As the plane's doors opened, emergency vehicles, ambulances, and airport officials were already lined up on the runway. Outside, applause and shouts of gratitude filled the air. Tom remained seated in the co-pilot's chair, unable to fully grasp what had just happened. His hands trembled, and his fingers felt numb after gripping the controls for so long. The stewardess gently touched his shoulder. "Tom, it's over. You did it. You saved us all." The boy turned to her slowly, his eyes brimming with tears. "I just didn't want anything to happen to my mom or anyone else." She smiled warmly at him. "You're a real hero." At that moment, Camilla, having exited the plane, saw her son in the cockpit. She ran to him, and the rescuers kindly let her through. Hugging him tightly, she couldn't hold back her tears. "Tom, my dear, my brave boy. I knew you could do it." Tom hugged her back, feeling her warmth anchor him to reality. It still felt like a dream or an incredible story, but his mother's embrace reminded him it was all real. On the runway, airport officials and flight control personnel waited. One of them, a man with gray hair and a stern but kind face, approached Tom and extended his hand. "Tom, I'm Jack Curtis, the dispatcher who guided you today. You're an incredibly brave boy. Many adult pilots wouldn't have been able to do what you just did." Tom, still a bit embarrassed, shook his hand. "I was just doing what you told me. I'm not a pilot." Jack Curtis smiled and placed his hand on his shoulder. "You were a real pilot. Never forget that." Meanwhile, journalists and photographers were already gathering nearby, trying to get the first comments from Tom. However, Camille, noticing how exhausted her son was, stepped firmly between them. "Excuse me, but he's just a child. We need to rest." The journalist didn't press further, understanding that the family deserved some peace after such an ordeal. But the story had already started spreading. Passenger and crew members' accounts of how a 12-year-old boy saved the plane quickly spread around the world. In the following days, Tom became a true sensation. His story appeared in newspapers, news broadcasts, and on the internet. But he tried to avoid the attention. Instead of giving interviews, he preferred to spend time with his mom and return to his usual activities. The airline, whose plane was involved in the incident, organized a ceremony of gratitude for Tom and Camille. They were given a model of the airplane he had piloted with the inscription, "To our young hero who proved that the impossible is possible." Tom accepted the gift with gratitude, but what made him happiest wasn't the attention, but the fact that he had been able to save lives. This event only strengthened his desire to become a real pilot. One evening, sitting by the window in his room and looking at the stars, Tom whispered, "Someday I'll be a pilot, but next time it won't be an emergency. It will be my life." Camille, hearing these words, quietly entered the room and hugged her son. "You've already proven that you're capable of anything, Tom. This is just the beginning." Tom smiled at her and hugged her tightly. He knew that a long road lay ahead, but he was ready to walk it, to one day fulfill his dream, despite the global fame and the universal gratitude. Not everything went smoothly for Tom after that memorable day. A few weeks after the incident, the airline found itself at the center of a scandal. One of the passengers, businessman William Mason, filed a lawsuit against the company, claiming that they had exposed him and the other passengers to unnecessary risk. Moreover, he unexpectedly included Tom in the lawsuit, accusing the boy of taking control of the plane when he, being just a child, had no right to do so. This news shocked everyone who supported Tom. Television, the internet, and newspapers were once again filled with heated discussions. Opinions were divided. Most people continued to admire the boy's bravery, considering him a hero, but there were others who agreed with Mason, arguing that Tom's actions could have led to a disaster. Camille, upon hearing about this, couldn't contain her anger. How can they blame a child who saved their lives? He did more than any adult. The airline's lawyers immediately took up the case, stating that Tom's actions were forced and justified in the critical situation. However, William Mason was unwavering. At a press conference, he stated that the fact that the boy survived and managed to land the plane was a miracle. But miracles don't cancel out the rules. Planes must be piloted by professionals, not children. Tom, who was trying to stay out of the media frenzy, couldn't ignore what was happening. One evening, he asked his mother, "Mom, what if he's right? Maybe I really did something wrong." Camille hugged him tightly. "Tom, you saved lives. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." Meanwhile, to protect their young hero, the airline organized support. Famous pilots and aviation experts spoke out in defense of Tom, explaining that his actions were dictated by necessity and he couldn't have done otherwise. The case went to court, which lasted several months. Tom did not attend the hearings as his lawyers insisted that it would cause him emotional harm, but eventually the court issued a ruling. The boy could not be held responsible for the situation as his actions were forced, and the blame for the incident lay with the airline due to negligence in crew training and the technical state of the plane. After the trial, interest in Tom's story began to fade. He was able to return to his normal life, but the ordeal left a deep mark on his soul. These events only strengthened his desire to become a pilot. After school, Tom enrolled in an aviation institute, where he studied everything related to aviation with incredible determination. He spent countless hours in simulators, asked experienced pilots questions, and studied every detail. However, the traces of the scandal didn't disappear completely. When Tom began his career at an American airline, he encountered bias. Some colleagues whispered behind his back, remembering the incident. But over time, thanks to his hard work and knowledge, he earned their respect. A few years later, Tom became a captain. He piloted planes all over the world, and his name became a symbol of determination and courage. One day, 10 years after that memorable day, he took his mother on his first flight as captain. Camille, sitting by the window, proudly looked at the airplane wing, knowing that her son was on top. Before takeoff, Tom approached her, smiled, and said, "Mom, today I can say I've fulfilled my dream." Camille couldn't hold back her tears. "You've always been my hero, Tom. Thank you for listening to the story till the end. Don't forget to leave your thoughts about this story. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends and family. It motivates us to continue working on new stories every day. Don't miss the next amazing story that will soon appear on your screen. We're so grateful that you're with us. See you soon.